Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you would like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On today's episode, Nicole LeBlanc returns to Autism Stories to discuss the impact of long COVID on autistic people and what can be done to possibly reduce these challenges. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Nicole, thanks so much for returning here on Autism Stories.
You're welcome. It's great to be on your show again.
Absolutely. Earlier this year, you wrote, and this, the reason why I wanted to talk to you is you wrote an article, Personal Centered Healthcare in the New Normal, which talked about how being autistic increases one's risk of COVID complications. So, what are the types of symptoms research is starting to uncover that COVID-19 worsens for us as autistic people?
Well, in the autism neurodiversity world, COVID-19 can worsen, mental health symptoms, anxiety, sleep. It can elevate the stress response, and it can also cause gut issues, thyroid dysfunction. Like, for instance, when we look at, during the initial infection and after, it can cause things like, if we go back to the variant in 2021, it can cause panic attacks, tremors, worsening anxiety, worsening sleep, gut issues, diarrhea, worsening TMJ, thyroid dysfunction. And this can even happen even if the initial infection is asymptomatic, which may not always show up on a COVID test. I say this as somebody who's had this virus twice. The first time during end of August 2021, I developed rash, bleeding gums, panic, anxiety attacks, tremors, gut issues, thyroid dysfunction, worsening food intolerances. And yet, every time I went to go get tested, every test kept on coming back negative. My primary care regular doctors kept blowing me off as, oh, everything's normal. Oh, it's all in your head nonsense. I went and saw a rheumatologist. They did tests that showed some elevated markers, but couldn't tell what it was from. I had a gastroenterologist do like an IBD panel that showed, high elevation for Crohn's disease, high rate of inflammation, C-reactive protein, worsening vitamin D, B12, iron, which, I already had B12 iron deficiency prior to the pandemic due to dairy and gluten intolerance, which is common in this population. In addition, COVID-19 can worsen vitamin D, B12 iron deficiency, and low D can increase risk of long COVID. Also being, having high stress levels, high cortisol levels is another thing that can cause more severe COVID and long COVID. In addition, gut health, what they're now finding, plays a big role in the severity of infection, whether or not you bounce back quickly or not. And I say this as somebody who, since, back in 2021, I started seeing functional medicine docs, and they finally started giving answers that will go into more detail.
I've supported a fellow autistic person in going to doctor's appointments who's had long COVID symptoms for, I think, at least 2 years now. In most cases, the doctors really haven't given much helpful information, doctor after doctor. So, what might be some ways the doctors could be more helpful to autistic patients who meet with them and share with them a long list of symptoms that most likely is related to long COVID?
Is be willing to listen to people, understand that we know our bodies best, and be willing to, do tests that are actually going to focus on what's the root cause. Like, for instance, here, like one thing, when we look at Western medicine versus functional medicine, Western medicine is about just putting a band-aid on the symptoms, whereas functional medicine is about the root cause. Like, for instance, if I compare my experience going from dealing with Western medicine over the last 3 years to functional medicine, functional medicine has been able to, okay, get at the root cause. Okay, gut dysbiosis, leaky gut, candida is what's causing your symptoms. Low thyroid, like, for instance, if your thyroid is on the suboptimal low end of normal, that can still cause symptoms like fatigue, gut issues, and what have you, unrestful sleep, and so forth, which is something that Western medicine doc is just going to dismiss and say, "Oh, your thyroid's normal," whereas a functional medicine practitioner will say, "Okay, your thyroid is low. Okay, let's try this supplement here." And then, of course, last resort, levothyroxine, which is what I'm on now, T3, because 80% of all disease begins in the gut. 80% of your immune system is in your gut. And they're finding that gut dysbiosis, which is a term Western medicine does not really recognize, gut dysbiosis, leaky gut, is one of the major drivers of long COVID and COVID severity. Things like Candida O growth.
As we go along, there's more and more research about COVID. So I'm wondering, near the end of 2023, what is the current research saying about COVID, long COVID, and autism? What is that connection in the research up to this point saying?
Well, one thing that's becoming apparent is that the greater the autistic traits, the greater the risk neuropsychiatric symptoms. COVID-19 can, cause things like panic, anxiety attacks, worsening anxiety, tremors, like with the most recent variant. Most recently in middle of October, my employer held an in-person conference in Massachusetts for one of the jobs I do well. 2 weeks later, and literally half of everybody, all of us it ended up turning into a COVID super spreader. My prime symptoms with that bout of it were, primary, worsening anxiety, worsening sleep, intense crying spells, intense pains all over, like muscle tension, no fever. And both times between 2021 to 2023, no fever, no sore throat, no pink eye, none of the obvious that makes we've all been told at the beginning of this to look for. And studies are showing that, greater the autistic traits, the higher the risk of developing PTSD from this. And another thing that's well established in the autism neurodiverse world is that in the literature, neurodiverse patients have higher rates of autoimmune disease than the general population, which oftentimes that doesn't get triggered until, all of a sudden a virus like COVID-19. Like, many scientists believe long COVID is an autoimmune virus where the body attacks itself. And that's from a doctor in Vermont named Melissa Hausner, who opened up a specialty clinic called All Brains Belong Vermont because she was seeing a massive wave of long COVID in neurodiverse populations and people begging for help. Other things, neurological and neuropsychiatric symptoms are emerging as a major long-term squeal in patients with pre-existing behavioral symptoms such as ASD, and it can even occur in both the acute phase and the post-stage. Cognitive dysfunction, brain fog, TMJ, worsening sleep. Like one study showed that autistic traits predicted PTSD from COVID-19. Individuals with higher autistic traits were more susceptible to COVID-19 PTSD because it can disrupt the fight, flight. It can also cause, gut issues like bloating. Like, for instance, before the pandemic, I could eat raw vegetables without major difficulty. Now I have to cook all my stuff because it makes one bloated like crazy. They now think long COVID may also be caused by low serotonin. And then many of us in the autism world also have gut issues, which also plays a major role into severity.
Definitely a shout out to Dr. Hauser. I've had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Hauser here on Autism Stories, and she is wonderful. Now, earlier you were talking about Western medicine versus functional medicine. So I'm wondering, do you think there might be some types of medicine or therapy that doctors should be recommending that aren't that common to help reduce the symptoms that, as autistic people, we might be experiencing from COVID?
Well, things to try are, diet and supplement recommendations. See a functional nutritionist. Do acupuncture, zero balancing, myofascial release. Do Epsom salt baths regularly, and focusing on a gut healing program. And by healing the gut, that means go off of, that means stop eating processed food, high sugar foods, cut that stuff out, and go to organic, all natural cooking, all produce as much as possible, organic meat, follow the Dirty Dozen list, then meet with a functional nutritionist who can give you a gut reset protocol on top of, seeing zero balancing, massage, acupuncture to focus on, the mind body connecting, getting out of the fight, flight, somatic experiencing, zero balancing, massage, myofascial release. And then, of course, focusing on those, programs they have for like resetting the breath when it comes to PTSD. Because COVID can activate the fight, flight, disrupt the HPA axis.
As part of your article, Personal Centered Healthcare in the New Normal, you discussed a lot of different ways in which the mental health care system could become much more person centered. And I really appreciate that, because a lot of times articles will just talk about the problems, but they won't necessarily talk about like some actual solutions to the problem. And one of the ways that you discussed is to fund peer-run mental health groups through Medicaid, Medicare, and private insurance to allow mental health providers to hire people with lived experience to support those new to mental health systems. So I'm interested. Well, for one, I think these groups are so important. But what's been your experience in participating in peer-run groups?
Well, I say, peer run, because, like, for instance, in Vermont, the state of Vermont gives a lot of money to the mental health peer organizations, but they don't do a lot to the DD world, self advocacy organizations, which, that could, doing stuff like that and having more groups like that could help, especially, in dealing with trauma. COVID-19 is a virus that causes trauma. People with autism are more sensitive to trauma than the general population. Like, for instance, for somebody like me, my nervous COVID-19, if you read up, can dysregulate the nervous system. And my nervous system sees, COVID as like, okay, it's like being hit by a train, hit by a truck. And it's like, whoa, time out. Which is why it packs a greater punch than cold, flu, strep throat, stomach flu, walking pneumonia, every other ailment I can think of I've dealt with in my life. So this year is like the viral equivalent of cancer. And just having access, that can focus on trauma sensitivity, processing trauma. Like we look, there's not a lot of mental health therapists out there that are trained in autism or that take Medicaid. Many of us are all low income. And in the self-advocacy world, peer-run support groups are a great way for us to have safe spaces where we can just vent, get everything off our chest without judgment, without anybody, without listening to people say, oh, it's all in your head nonsense. That is one thing I've found, this pandemic has exposed the ableism in our healthcare system. And it's like, God, with Western medicine docs, I see that, okay, they know you have autism and a history of anxiety. They'll be like, they're more likely to say, oh, it's all in your head nonsense. Like if somebody calls up a primary care doctor, let's say, asking for a COVID test and whatnot, coming in with weird symptoms that they can't figure out what's going on.
Another one of your suggestions was to train medical students, long term care providers, and employers on how to be trauma sensitive. Now, this is essential for people with autism who are often more sensitive to all types of trauma. So, what are some of the principles of trauma informed care that you think are commonly missed by providers?
Well, for one, validating, general society, validating us, not gaslighting and all that. Like for instance, you go back to the summer, like I have relatives that just chalk all these ailments up to aging. And I'm like, excuse me, if you look at my lab results from 2021, and you type in COVID-19, you can clearly see that it's from. Testing is not all 100% accurate. We need to face reality. And it's like, and of course, not everybody with a disability can, do administer those at-home tests. Me, I always have to go someplace to have somebody get it done as somebody who does not get HCBS supports and who's, fighting DDA.
And is there anything that we haven't discussed, Nicole, about COVID-19 and person-centered mental health care that you think would be important for us to talk about?
Well, it's essential because we look at HHS developing that long COVID advisory committee, which I applied to be on, and as we look at wrestling as a society with the complications of this virus, it's essential that autism, developmental disability, neurodiversity be at the table. We're one of the populations that's most at risk for negative outcomes from this virus, both mental and physical. Nothing about us without us. We are not disposable. Just because it's mild for one person does not mean it's mild for the next. COVID-19 is still worse than the common cold, flu, strep throat, stomach flu, everything under the sun, dating back to my childhood.
Well, Nicole, I really appreciate you returning to Autism Stories to talk about this subject, because I think there's so many people that this is greatly impacting in our community, and I don't think there's a lot of great information out there about it. And just having this discussion that this, just having this discussion to let people know that, like, hey, you're not alone. Like, there's a lot of people dealing with this would be.
And if anybody here wants, suggestions for help, assistance, email me, nleblanc677@gmail.com.
And we'll definitely include that information, Nicole, in the podcast description for this episode. So thanks so much for joining me today here on Autism Stories.
And thanks for having me on your show. Have a nice day, everyone.
We always love hearing from you, and would especially love to hear from you relating to this episode on how has long COVID impacted your life. We also want to thank Nicole so much for this conversation. To read Nicole's article about long COVID, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. Here at Autism Personal Coach, our clients are the experts, our coaches are the guides. The majority of supports for autistics are not helpful. They try to fix us, not support us. That's why many are confused when we say our clients are the experts of their lived experience. Our clients are the experts for what has worked for them and about the things that they need and want in their lives. Our coaches first listen to our clients and then ask thoughtful questions, offer resources, and strategize with our clients so they can get what they need to thrive. Would you want a guide in your life to coach you to get you the things you desire? If so, then visit autismpersonalcoach.com for more information. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism Stories, and if you did, if you could tell a friend, foe, or anyone you know about it so they could have the same enjoyable and educational experience as you when listening to Autism Stories, be very much appreciated. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.